evening, everybody, and welcome. Hello, especially to today's wonderful guest, Dr. Alex Stein. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Quite, innovated with your intro video, full of excitement of fate and world.
You got to have a little bit of fun. You know, it's a very serious topic, this, so you've got to find the moments to have a little bit of comedy.
Absolutely. And you don't get a lot of laughs when you're in a cult, that's for sure.
No, exactly. So it's just a little thing to put a smile on people's faces. But I'm so appreciative of your time. Thank you so much for joining me, Alex. Great name. We share the same first name, or very similar at least. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Alex Stein is how would you describe yourself? Would you describe yourself as the director of Family Survival Trust, or a member of the board?
I'm the acting chair of the Family Survival Trust. Yeah. And therefore a member of the board, which I have been for some years now. Yeah.
And you have a wealth of experience fighting cults, and you have a lot of academic credentials behind you. And I thought it would be good to have you on board to talk about the coercive control legislation in the UK and the changes that are needed to that. So do you want to first start by introducing yourself and what the Family Survival Trust does, for those who maybe don't know?
Okay, and just to start with myself, I was in my basically mid-20s to mid-30s, spent 10 years in a supposedly left-wing, but it wasn't really, cult in Minneapolis in the US, and came out of that and decided I had to figure out what the hell had happened to me. And from there ended up, I mean, that was now I think 33 years ago, 34 years ago. Wow, I'm getting old. Anyway, it was a long time ago. And I started being an activist and then studying, and wrote my first book, which was really about that experience, and the second book, which was an academic book about how all this works. Anyway, and then I've now been involved with the Family Survival Trust for, I don't know, it must be going on for 7 or 8 years. The Family Survival Trust was originally called FAIR, and it was started sometime in the 70s, the late 70s, I think, by parents who had lost their adult children to primarily Scientology and the Moonies, aka the Unification Church and all its various other pseudonyms that it uses. And they were, back then people didn't really understand much about this at all, a lot less than we understand now. And they provided information and support and so on. And then, I can't quite remember the year, but several years ago, it was decided to make FAIR a charity. And at that point, it changed its name to Family Survival Trust. And during the period of its lifetime, it's kind of changed from mostly being parents of people in cults to then it was people like me who had been in cults as adults. And now really the majority of our board is now people who grew up in cults. So, I mean, we also have other, it's never just been one focus, but it's been interesting to see how that's changed. And particularly that the people who were brought up in cults are now finding a voice to talk about how dreadful that is. And we do 3 different kind of prongs of activity. We try and do some public education, which is generally 1 public event a year at this point. We have a support group, or a couple of them, that's now online since COVID. And we are also doing some policy work, which currently is focused on this campaign that you want to talk about tonight, about changing the legislation about coercive control. So that's kind of FST in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's great that you've kind of brought on board people with so much experience, especially like yourself, having both academic experience and also personal experience from being in a cult. I think it's really important to draw on different people's perspectives and provide support, because you mentioned there about, second generation cult survivors, people who've been brought up in cults. There are a lot of differences between someone who joins a cult and somebody who is raised in a cult without their choice, without their willingness to do it. They had no choice. But there are also a lot of similarities. The tools and the tricks that cults use to manipulate and coerce and control its members are the same, regardless of how you came into it. So I think it's important to have all of those voices to make sure you're providing the support that's needed across the board.
And just to say, we've got some wonderful volunteers, and we're largely a volunteer-run organization. Occasionally, we have paid some people a little bit, but mostly it's just people's time that they give.
Yeah. And have you, just before we go into the coercive control legislation, I just had a question off the top of my head. You're talking about you're seeing more and more people come through that have grown up in cults. Do you think that's a generational shift because of the whole, cults really came to fruition in the 60s, 70s, 80s? That was kind of the cult, boom, if you like. I mean, there were cults beforehand, of course, and there are still cults now. But do you think that that's an impact of that growth in cultic movements back then, that you're now seeing more people growing up, or is it coincidental?
I think that's part of it. I mean, again, they have some of the really big cults have been around for a long time, like Jehovah's Witnesses and Exclusive Brethren. So you also have people who are not second generation, they're third, fourth, fifth generation. So, but you're right, there was a certain peak or something, not peak, but a boom.
Trough, more like.
Yeah. And also now we've got loads of them. So we don't really have the statistics to know, how many people when. But I think, and I'm not sure if I'm right, when I started out in this 34 years ago, there was very little going on. I mean, there was the Cult Awareness Network, which now is owned by Scientology. Thank you, Alex.
Stop, that wasn't me. I wasn't around then.
But was a good organization doing cult awareness. And then there was the predecessor to the International Cultic Studies Association, which was called the American Family Foundation. And at least in the US, there wasn't much else. I think there were a couple people in the UK, sort of one-person information centers, and then FAIR, as I mentioned. There wasn't much literature. I mean, when I got out, Steve Hassan had written his first book, which was very helpful to me. Margaret Singer, whose name must not be forgotten because she did incredible work, sometimes working with Janja Lalich in writing books. She had Cults in Our Midst, was the book there. And there was, of course, Lifton's work. And there wasn't a whole lot else. I mean, there were other scholars. There was Laughlin doing some who had done interesting scholarship earlier. And but there wasn't very much. So then the way I look at it is some of us, Janja Lalich, Steve Hassan, a bit later myself, started doing more scholarship based on that little bit that existed. And we were really, the way I see it, the first people who had, as we now call it, lived experience, who then went on and did this scholarship, which that first lot I mentioned were kind of outsiders, but had done really good work nonetheless. You don't only have to have lived experience to be able to understand this phenomena. So then we came along and wrote books, and Janja Lalich did tremendous work in many books. And I'm sure I'm missing out people, and I'm sorry if I'm missing out people. So I think that gave, I always look on these things as you stand on the shoulders of the people who did the work previously, and you build on that work. So I think partly the second generation people, as they became adults, had a little bit more information than we had. So then, and some of them are now going into for higher education and producing really good research. So I think that's part of it. And I think also that people were speaking out more, that, the more people speak out, as we know, the more other people can speak out. And, we've seen this with #MeToo and all kinds of other social movements. There's been such layers of secrecy and shame and fear and guilt and all these horrible things that, it's not easy to, even if it wasn't your fault because you were born in, it's still not easy to say, well, actually, I was raised in a cult that did these crazy things. There's a stigma to it. But I think that stigma has been somewhat lessened. It's still there, but it's been somewhat lessened the more people have spoken out. Then I think the other thing in the last 10 years, I mean, the last 5 to 8 years, we've seen an explosion of media. And that really wasn't the case when I first came out. There would be some things here and there. But now every day there's some new, whether it's a podcast like yours, whether it's a BBC thing, whether it's a Netflix thing, there's this huge amount of media going on, which has its own reasons, I think, why that's become important, not the least of which is Trump. And the other element being ISIS, because that was, excuse my dog. Jojo.
Your dog doesn't like those two names. Right.
So there's, there's just generally in the world become a bit more this word cult, which, by the way, some scholars don't want us to use. Many, who are on the side of Scientology and the Moonies. But the general public is starting to say, yeah, there are these things, and they all seem to be very oppressive. And we're going, when we say cult, this is what we think of as this closed group that's sort of, guess what, brainwashing people, which we're now talking about. Well, let's talk about that as coercive control, because there's a law that describes this phenomena.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, is talking about, cults are very different in many ways. Scientology is very different to the Moonies or the Mormon Church or the Jehovah's Witnesses or any of the other groups you mentioned. But what kind of links them all together is the way they employ the same tactics to assert control over its members. And Steve Hassan has a great bite model. If they're controlling your behavior, information, thought, and emotion, then you've got yourself a cult, because you're being controlled in all these aspects. And that's what I think it's really important when it comes to education and looking at things from an academic or from a scholarly perspective. It's like, okay, how do these things actually work? What mechanisms do they use that makes them different from a genuine, real religious movement that doesn't, fall into the cult category? Would you agree?
Yeah, and just to say, there are many models. I mean, the three principal, Lifton, of course, had a model, which was his 8 criteria, which he developed from the Chinese and North Korean re-education and prison camps, which is still, that's very sound model. Janja Lalich, of course, has an important model, bounded choice. I have a model, my 5 points of charismatic authoritarian leader, isolating structure, isolating absolute belief system, process of coercive control. So I put that as one of the elements. And then the result, the 5th one being the result being controllable and exploitable followers. So we have these different models, but we're all agreed that we're seeing the same thing. We're using slightly different lenses and angles, but we're all looking at the same elephant. And to go into another metaphor, I love to mix my metaphors, be warned. The way I look at cults is they're a machine, and they're like a car. And if you take the wheels off a car, it's not going to go anywhere. And you have to have wheels, and you have to have some kind of engine, and you have to have some kind of body. And I think cults are the same. The car can be all different colors, cheap, expensive, etc. We shouldn't talk about cars today, given the cultic authoritarian car of the day, the Tesla. But anyway, sorry, I digress. You have to have all these elements working together. You can't just have one of them, and you can use that with Steve's bite model, you know, you need to control all those elements. And same with Yanya's model, same with Lifton, same with mine. They all work in it's a machine. And the way people enter the system, this machine system, varies. You know, there's all kind of different ways. They can be kidnapped, like Patty Hearst was, or like the child soldiers in some of these African, like the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, which is a kind of cultic political army. You can join, like I did, and like presumably you did. You can be born in, you know, there's different ways you get into this machine, and there's different ways you get out. Some people get thrown out, some people leave. Sometimes the machine breaks and it implodes. You know, part of the machine disappears, the leader dies or whatever. So, and the outside of the machine, the belief system, the way it's presenting itself to the world, and to a degree to its followers, as you mentioned, is different. You know, I was in a so-called Marxist-Leninist cult. You know, we were talking before we came online about religious fervor and what that does to the brain. Well, in our cult, we didn't really have religious fervor. We just had overwork and exhaustion. And, you know, I will be a good soldier kind of thing. But it all worked the same in terms of we were isolated. There was this leader that everything came from, who had total control. Our family relationships were completely controlled. We weren't allowed to do anything else. Everything was controlled about our lives. We were exhausted and dissociated. And that's kind of key in the work I've done, is looking at how the dissociation happens. And we were essentially slaves. And getting out was very difficult and very frightening. And I think a lot of those things are pretty universal in all cults, because they kind of have to go together. Otherwise, you can't control people. There's a specific mechanism that helps you control people without violence. It's easy to control someone if you're pointing a gun at them. But the violence in cults, there can be violent, but it's generally implied. And it's not necessarily the primary thing. It's the psychological control that's the primary method. So anyway.
And yeah, I absolutely agree. And specifically from, you know, my experience in Scientology, it's, you know, I was locked in a room, yes, but there was never a time when I felt like I was in imminent danger of, you know, being physically harmed. It's a prison of the mind, a prison of belief. You know, you are coerced into thinking that if you speak out or if you do this, you'll lose all of your family, you'll lose your connections to your friends, you'll, you know, lose this and that. And so you get coerced into staying in and agreeing to things that you don't want to agree to, because out of fear, because you're scared, but no one's actually pointing a gun at your head. And that's something that I found quite challenging when it comes to law enforcement and speaking and educating, speaking to people about, you know, the coercion in Scientology is, you know, well, for example, in the Sea organization with forced abortions, you know, Scientology never actually physically force you to go undergo a surgery, you know, to, you know, go through that. But they do tell you, well, look, you have a choice. You either have your baby and leave the Sea organization, which means losing your family and losing your friends and being separated from your partner and this, that, and the other. You have no resume, no money to fall back on, all of that. Or you can get rid of your baby and continue working the Sea Org and not lose anything. So it's a coerced decision. You know, but it's not really a decision because you don't have any other options. So that the term of, you know, being forced to do something doesn't mean there's a gun to your head. You know, there are other ways of manipulating people into complying with orders, right?
And the way you've just described that, you know, Janja Lalich, that's what she terms bounded choice. You know, you're given this choice. And it also relates to another really good scholar, Benjamin Zablocki, who died a few years ago, where he talked about exit costs, that there are huge costs to leaving, which you've just named. And I would like to add another one, which is, I think, that you're living in a constant state, either low, middle, or high, of hypervigilance and anxiety when you're in a cult. You're just like, am I okay? Am I following the rules? What's going to happen if I do this? Am I going to get punished? Is something bad going to happen to me? And that isn't necessarily a rational thing, in that there's not necessarily rule that, well, like you just said, but if I do this bad thing, I'm going to get hit. It's not clear like that. It's just there's an atmosphere of ongoing fear of the outside world, fear of the end of the world, fear of all the badness inside you, which they tell you you have, fear of that you will get in trouble. And it just becomes this kind of great knot of anxiety that you don't know is there. You're not aware of it, but it's in your body. Your anxiety chemicals, the cortisols, are way out of whack. In a normal life, we go up and down without anxiety and our feeling safe. None of us are feeling safe all the time, but we have ways to bring ourselves down if we're mentally halfway coping in the world, and usually through other people or our own internal sense of self. In a cult, you don't have that. You just have the cortisols running amok, and no good way to feel like you're safe. And so because you're not aware of that, it becomes what I sort of call this nameless fear. And getting out, you have to move through that, plus all the fears you just talked about, those very concrete fears. And it's bloody terrifying.
Yeah.
And then, it's absolutely terrifying. And then after you get out, the recovery process, I mean, there's a lot of elements to the recovery process, but one of them is starting to understand what that fear is, and also just letting your body relax. Getting some sleep, getting some comfort, eating properly, having time to just, look at smell the roses, so to speak. Mm-hmm. You just and that takes a long time for your body just to settle down and get those cortisols back in some kind of balance. It's an intense experience. And try explaining that to the police,
Yeah, absolutely. And SP Crusader Leni here, she's a regular on the channel. She's one of my moderators. She's lovely, and she says, comment, I've been out 13 years and still feel like that. I agree. That hypervigilance, that anxiety, that always looking at what you're doing and reflecting on whether that's the right thing to do or not, that's something that does take a long time to recover from, because it's so deep rooted in the way your brain works, right? Because of the manipulation and the coercive control.
And I'm curious if SP Crusader and hello was brought up in the
Scientology
group.
Yeah,
because I think it's more difficult for people who are brought up, because in my case, from the age of 26 to 36, I was in the cult. But before the cult, my family's completely nuts, but, I had various relationships and good memories, and, I had a sense of myself and who I was. And I had some touchstones I could go back to. And I had a lovely sister who was supportive when I got out. And so I had a way of understanding what relative normalcy was like. And I think for people born or brought up in cults, that's much more difficult to get. I do believe that is possible, but one has to make an alternative, some kind of family, what we call fictive kin or chosen family, which could just be really close friends, some kind of. It doesn't even have to be a lot of them. It can be one. You need to find some safety after you get out. That's in our modern society, in our contemporary society, we live in isolating societies, in environments, which is why these cults are successful and why they boom in such times. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I do believe it to be possible. And one shouldn't give up. I'm sure you're not giving up, any of you.
And Leni here is saying I was 10 when my parent joined, and yeah, same with me. You know, I joined Scientology, but I was 15. So I think it's, you know, it's important when you take into consideration the age, because even though I wasn't raised in Scientology, and you know, Leni was 10, that's still too young to have a real sense of yourself and who you are before your cult experience, right?
Yeah, you haven't built adult relationships, and you are children. And your brains are certainly far from being fully developed. So absolutely.
So moving on to coercive control, how would you define coercive control first? How would you describe what that is and what that looks like?
Well, I think for the purposes of this discussion, we should use the legal definition, because that's what, you know, I've got my whole complicated definition. It's not that complicated, but well, I'll give you mine first, and then we'll look at the legal one. So my shortest version of how I look at this is, if you isolate people, you engulf them in a system that claims to be the good place and the only good place. But that good place is also creating fear. So you've got isolation, engulfment, and fear. Those, I think, are the three things, when they're working together, that create an emotional bond to the cult, because there's nowhere else, because you've been isolated and that's the only place left. But you're bonding to the source of fear, which is obviously not what humans need to do. If you did that, you'd run into the jaws of the lion on the savannah, you know, which is really what we do when we are in cults. And so that's maladaptive, and it means that our brains then dissociate, because it's not a solution for survival to run towards the fearful stimulus. We should be running away or fighting. So instead of fighting or fleeing, we're basically freezing, and that's happening in the brain. So we're not thinking carefully, or hardly at all. And so the cult can tell us how and what to think. So that's my kind of short version. The coercive control law does not go into things at that level, but it's a very, very good law as far as it goes, because it talks about the mechanisms of how a perpetrator can gain control over a victim for the benefit of the perpetrator and without regard for the needs of the victim. This sounds like a cult already, doesn't it?
And this is legislation that came in under the Serious Crime Act in 2015, right? So in the UK, right, landmark, you know, new piece of legislation that made coercive control illegal. And this is what you're talking about now, right?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good context. And it was achieved by a lot of work and campaigning of women's organizations. So we've got a great debt to those organizations and all the women who did that work, and those women who had lived experience of that. So it was first seen as a kind of gender issue, really, that this happened to women. But then that's no longer the case. I think the guidance just says, you know, this mostly happens to women, but it's not just a women's issue. Okay, so in that law, they talk about a pattern of behavior. So it's not a one-off. It's not if, you know, somebody once keeps you isolated for a day. You know, it's a pattern that repeats. And then they list all these different behaviors, which to those of us who've been in cults are extremely familiar. So they will control your social relationships. In other words, they isolate you. They control your finances. They control what you wear, what you eat, who you live with, your sexuality, and if and when you have sex, your relationship with your children, your communication, with other people. So, you know, we hear of domestic abusers checking the phone of their victim. And that may not be how it happens in a cult, but they will certainly control your communication. And I've got, you know, good examples of that in my own experience. And anyway, a bunch of other things where they control the minutiae of your life. They control your time. You know, you're not off at the, you know, pub or the bowling alley or wherever. You know, you're doing what you're told. So it really describes exactly what happens in a cult, but it says this only is a crime, and this is the ridiculous and frustrating thing about this law. If this is I'm trying to remember the wording, can't quite remember the wording, I'm sorry, because it changed recently. It changed in 2021, the wording.
It can be perpetrated by a current or a former partner as well as a family member. So it only applies to close domestic partnerships and relationships.
Right. And here is the problem. If I'm in my home and my, you know, partner or my child or my auntie who lives with me does this pattern of behaviors to me, where they're hyper controlling all the details of my life, that is a crime. If my neighbor does it to me, or my church or my political group or my yoga studio, that is totally okay. There's no crime. I voluntarily am allowing them to do that, supposedly. And the poor police, I kind of feel sorry for them because of that limitation, when us people from cults go to the police with a complaint of something horrible that's happened, they say, oops, you know, I'm sorry this happened to you. Nothing I can do. Oh, you gave all your inheritance to this group. Oh, you will, you know, whatever. You know, you voluntarily did it. So it's really makes no logical sense. And why that limitation was put in there, I have yet to discover. The chair of FST, Tom Sackville, former MP, and really has done a lot of great work in this field. I think his sort of hypothesis was that this was probably from the churches, that they kind of insisted, maybe the Catholic Church, maybe the Church of England, that this be, they didn't want to get involved in being in this law. But those of us who are campaigning for this, we don't care about religion. I don't care what a person believes. They can believe in operating thetans if they want. I really don't care. And some people do. You know, as I like to say, some of my best friends believe some things that I think are complete nonsense. But, you know, that's their right. Otherwise, we're talking about thought control, right? It's the behavior that's the problem. And there's an organization, the National Working Group on Spiritual and Ritual Abuse, which I think you've just been introduced to. And one of the phrases that they've used, which I think is really strong, is challenge the behavior, not the belief. So that's what the problem. So, you know, and there's been a lot of history, and I think a lot of this funded by some of the big cults, by the way, of a certain set of scholars and psychologists and lawyers and others who keep trying to make us conflate this problem. And they say we're trying to remove freedom of religion. Well, we're not. Many of our members have religious faith. It's really not to do with that. But they keep wanting to focus on the belief bit, and we're saying no. And you know, so we need to be very clear about that. That, you know, it's the patterns of behavior. Now, those patterns of behavior in a cult may be justified with language of belief, but that language can be completely different. In mine, it was, you know, Marxist dialectics, used wrongly, by the way. In yours, it was, you know, this weird Scientology stuff. But if you look at the patterns of how that speech is used, then again, you see similarities. So, for instance, it never makes sense. It's not logical. But again, if that was all it was, that's not a problem. But the speech is used as part of this machine of coercion. The same way in a domestic relationship, the speech might be, darling, I love you. You know, I'm your husband. If you loved me, you would do this. You know, that's the speech that's used in an intimate relationship that can be used as part of the system of control. But on its own, it's not controlling. It's only controlling when it goes with all the other things, the isolation, the hyper control, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
I think it's particularly difficult when you look at, you know, cults and religious cults like Scientology, because I get this quite often. I talk about how with my activism, I'm trying to separate the beliefs from the behaviors. I have no problem if someone wants to be a Scientologist, wants to believe in Xenu, the overgalactic warlord that dropped H-bombs on volcanoes 75 million years ago. You know, if you want to believe that, that's fine. If you want to believe in the policy of disconnection and fair game, that's fine. But doing those things, the behaviors, are what's not okay. It's okay if you believe that the grass is blue and the sky is green. But if you start, you know, acting differently towards people who believe differently to you, then that becomes a problem. And so separating behavior from belief is really important. But with Scientology, particularly in religious cults, it's hard because then you have the question of, can you have the belief without the behavior? And I think that's a very important debate to have, but later down the line, because Scientology, the coercive control is so embedded in its very nature. If you took away all of the controlling, you know, harmful parts, you wouldn't actually have much left. But if you want to believe in it, that's fine.
Yeah. And also it's tricky because, you know, for instance, there's Catholic cults, you know, so we're not going to say all Catholicism is controlling. I mean, some people might argue that, but I would argue back that not all Catholicism is cultic, or, you know, all left-wing political groups are cultic, or all right-wing political groups are cultic. Some are, and they're very dangerous. So, and yes, they kind of, the way you talk about the beliefs is different. You're right. They're not the same, because in a reasonable one, you can sort of understand what's being said and it's not completely barking mad. But so I kind of agree with what you're saying, but I also just want to be clear that it's, you know, Scientology is a particular example because it's this very specific belief system. But even there, you know, I don't know if they're still around, but there used to be ex-Scientologists who created their own sort of little more benign groups that did the
free zone.
Stuff. Yeah. You know, I'm sure it didn't work that well. I can't imagine it did. But, you know, that was a way of trying to have the beliefs without the oppression.
Yeah. And I think the behavior thing is such an important stepping stone, because, you know, I'm not qualified to enter into a debate about whether you should ban Scientology as a belief system because it's harmful in and of itself. I personally believe that it's harmful in and of itself, but that doesn't mean I'm going to treat you differently if you're a Scientologist. But in order to approach conversations with legislators, with law enforcement, these people are trying to educate on this issue. It's really important to be able to say, no, look, we're not asking for you to ban cults. We're asking for you to ban the behavior that is already listed in legislation as illegal, but it only applies in a certain context. And that conversation, I found, is a lot easier to have with those people, because they suddenly realize you're not just an anti-religious bigot or someone that's just trying to, you know, smack down religion. You're just trying to say, hey, stop abusing people, right?
And just a couple things on that. Yeah, another piece of that law that's very good is it says that the victim often is unable to acknowledge they're a victim, which is exactly what we see in cults. And so that's a very strong thing, that someone else can report this person is being victimized. And that person might say, oh, no, I'm perfectly happy here, because they're under the control of the cult. the other thing is, I think it's really important to look at this change historically. So, it used to be like when I was a young woman, domestic violence, I mean, forget about coercive control, just plain old violence was not, there was nothing there. And it was my generation, not myself personally, but friends of mine who set up the first battered women's shelters in squats. They had no funding. They just provided these landing places for these women who had just been beaten. And then gradually that became an offense. And, it took a long time. And again, these organizations like Women's Aid and Refuge, I think it is. And then after that, it got more subtle and into the coercive control element. You didn't now have to show bruises and broken arms to prove that your partner was, abusing you. So now you don't need the bruises. You need this pattern of psychological control, which nearly always goes with the bruising, by the way, as well. So I feel like, that was, how old am I? 40, oh my God, nearly 50 years ago. So having that view, first we had to acknowledge what was happening with women getting beaten. Then we acknowledged much later the coercive control. And the next step is going to be that this happens not just in our intimate or personal relationship. It happens with therapists. It happens in one-on-one, non-related cults. It happens in tiny little groups. It happens in huge groups. It happens at the level of the state, like North Korea and, God help us, the US of A, what it's going through now. So, this is, I'm still a political animal in many ways. I recovered enough to be able to become political again, which I'd always been since a young age, coming from a political family as I did. It's, our work is really important right now because, another word for a cult is a totalitarian group. And we are seeing a lot of totalitarianism right now, as many people are aware. And so understanding it as we do on this small level can help us understand also politically on a much larger level why people keep voting against their interests, for instance. So these are important bits of work that we're engaged in.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to bring up, this is the government's, this is the Controlling or Coercive Behavior Statutory Guidance Framework. So this is what accompanies the actual legislation that we're talking about. And it talks about specifically religion and abuse relating to faith. So it says here, whilst faith can be a source of support and comfort to victims, domestic abuse can occur in relation to and through using an individual's faith and belief system. So it acknowledges here that religion or faith can be used as part of coercive control to abuse someone. Using religion and faith systems to control and subjugate a victim can be a form of emotional and psychological abuse. It is often characterized by a systematic pattern of controlling or coercive behavior within a religious context. Now, if it ended there, that would be fantastic. Excellent. That's what we want. But unfortunately, it goes on and it continues and can be perpetrated by a current or former partner as well as family members. So because it specifies those exact people that it can be perpetrated by, it excludes the application of this law to, for example, the relationship, like you mentioned, you might have with a therapist or with a pastor or a religious minister or a group leader or a friend, because it specifically applies only to partners, former partners and family members. And that's the change that we're campaigning for, right?
And you only need to look at the recent very good documentaries by the BBC, and there are many by other channels, and other production companies. But they did a fantastic series about T.B. Joshua's Synagogue Church of All Nations. Brilliant. That was a Africa, I think Nigeria, based group that came to the US and recruited here. And it wasn't just recruiting people of African origin, it was recruiting, young white women, because that's what the leader favored, or whatever, So there was a great documentary about that. There was a panorama about the United Church of the Kingdom of God, which is all over the UK and the world. We've got so many examples. And then, of course, there's the Lighthouse documentary, which was extremely good. Many others that have now been done. There's a forthcoming one, I believe, about the Jesus Army. We have no shortage of evidence at this point, and of witnesses, and of people who have been victimized. So yeah, I get frustrated, but the frustration doesn't get you anywhere. You have to just manage that and vent and then keep going, because I really not believe, I won't say I know because that's kind of arrogant, but I really believe we are going to get there, because it's too dissonant not to be able to include all these other forms of the exact same patterns of behavior as outlined in that statutory guidance, which, by the way, I highly recommend people read. It's a very, very interesting read. And if you've been in a cult, or you're concerned about someone who's in a cult, just go through and look at that. And so it's fascinating. Yeah.
I've just put a link in the live chat for anyone that wants to read it. I'll add it to the description of this podcast as well after it's over. We have L. Ron Hubbard himself here. What are your crimes, Alexandra Stein?
Well, there's a lot of them. It depends what category you're looking at.
But I wanted to ask,
my children.
I wanted to ask, we talked about the idea of changing this legislation, and you and I have been working very closely on this, along with the Family Survival Trust. And, I mentioned that I attended the National Working Group on Spiritual and Ritual Abuse, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes. And it's really powerful to collaborate and work together. And I'm so happy that we are able to do that. But what does the future look like? How do we go about actually getting this legislation changed, in your view?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a professional campaigner, but I try to listen to experts in the field and also to my own instincts. And I think it's a combination. Practically, like Family Survival Trust has now put out a briefing for MPs, which I know you have, Alex. And our purpose with that is that people can take that to their constituency MP. And if you are a constituent, the MP is obliged to talk to you in some way, shape, or form. And so if you have an interest or a concern about a cult in your constituency, which you will have because everywhere has a cult, let me tell you, you can take that briefing and say, here's what we're talking about. It's just a 2-side, 1.5 sides. It won't take them a second to read because they don't have much time. And try to get them on side. And if they show any interest, please let me or Alex know, so we can add them to our list. We already have a few MPs who are behind us in this. So I think that's the kind of practical thing that people can do. But I also think, and that's what's happening, is that we kind of, I'm a great, like I said, I'm still a political person, and I'm a great believer in building movements. And I think these alliances that we have is a kind of a little movement, a social movement. And the importance of it is that people can find us. If you're just one tiny little individual or tiny little group, that's more difficult. But if you can bring people together in a network, not in a cult, but in a nice, flexible, open network, where people can be involved, busy like me, or just occasionally pop in, we've got the range. And we can all work together on this and start pushing and talking about it, because the other thing is public awareness. And, whenever I do media interviews, I always try to bring this up and hope they don't edit it out. And just, just raising awareness with the public, talking about it, going to your MPs. I'm sure there's other ideas as well, but those are the ones I have. What do you think, Alex? You've been at this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's two aspects, isn't there? There's the public awareness and changing public opinion. You know, specifically for me, focusing on Scientology is like people think of it as a crazy American cult that doesn't really affect people in the UK. So there's raising awareness of no, this stuff is going on here, and this is how it works and how it abuses people at every level, even here in the UK. And Scientology is not the only group that does that. You know, this is a systematic problem with a large number of cults and groups across the world, but specifically here in the UK. And then there's also the educating law enforcement, you know, the NHS mental health services. You know, if you call up and ask for help because you've been a member of a cult, and you need some mental health support, the support doesn't exist that you need from an NHS perspective. And so there's a lot of education that needs to happen in how to support these people. And that's why the Family Survival Trust, the Aftermath Foundation are great resources for people leaving cults and Scientology and so on. But then there's also the legislative change, and that what you just described is exactly what I've been doing, going and contacting members of parliament and saying, hey, look, I'm not asking for you to rule on what should and shouldn't be allowed as a faith or a religion. I'm asking for you to re-look at this existing legislation and support a slight amendment that would broaden its application, which therefore would allow a huge number of people to seek justice who have not been able to seek justice before because the law is restrictive.
Yeah, because these cults, they kind of operate with impunity right now, more or less. And, you know, we're asking, as you said, it's a tiny change. I think we want 3 or 4 words taken out. That's it, really. Yeah, sorry, just brain fart. I had something else to say, but it's gone. It'll come back.
It's okay.
Yeah, and the public education, I agree with everything you just said. I think if we had the law, I mean, it's not necessarily which comes first. However, if we had a law, there would be a much stronger basis to say we need to fund help for people. We need to, you know, there are fewer and fewer. There are refuges for battered women. There are no refuges for people coming out of cults, you know, especially these people who are born and raised who come out with literally nothing and no one. You know, they just, and there's very bad outcomes for a lot of those people, you know, really bad. And the survivors are tough as anything to have managed that process. So, yeah, we need kind of some acknowledgement that this exists and this isn't just made up in our brains. You know, like the apologists, the scholars and psychologists who basically are in the pockets of the cults, like to say about us that we're just angry because we made a mistake and we came out and we're resentful and we're trying to punish these nice little groups because of our own mistake. And, you know, I'm not going to waste time on that, but it's nonsense. But they've had a lot of power, but less and less as more and more of us are speaking out. Yeah, there was still something I wanted to say, but it'll come back. Yeah.
Well, I think that, you know, that's true. That again, that argument falls apart when you realize, no, we're not trying to shut down your group, you know, Scientology. We're just trying to stop them from abusing people. So if you are saying that, you know, by getting rid of this coercive control behavior, that would be shutting the organization down, then you're admitting that it's a cult. So actually, you should be supportive of this because we're not asking for the government to step in and shut down these organizations. We're just saying stop abusing people. And so, you know, you know, it's a different, it just falls apart, their argument, when you look at it from that angle.
You know, Family Survival Trust, in 2022, we published a report where we'd done a survey about people who had experience in the UK or with UK-based cults. And we structured it around that guidance. You know, what are the things that happened? And, you know, you could tick everything, you know, all these people giving their first-person testimonies about how all these things had been done to them. And the results, the harms, you know, these terrible harms that had happened to people, mental, physical effects, financial effects, educational effects, none of them good, I might add. And then the lack of help that nearly all of them had experienced when they got out, the lack of justice that nearly all of them had experienced. One thing, maybe this was what I was trying to remember to say, is that when you're talking to other people trying to raise awareness, I found that quite a helpful thing is once you describe some of these mechanisms, however you choose to do it, you can sort of challenge people to say, well, don't you know anyone who's experienced this? And once people stop and think, nearly everybody says, well, it's funny you mentioned that, but, my cousin disappeared whenever. Or, yeah, my husband was in a funny group once. Or I went to this yoga studio and I got the creeps, so I left. It's once people have the language and the basic concepts, nearly everyone has had quite a close encounter. It's just they don't know it because we don't talk about it and they don't kind of have the language for it. So I really encourage people to try to have those conversations, but instead of saying, oh, Scientology is a bad group, you go down into the mechanisms and the coercive control and so forth and say, oh, have you experienced something like this? It's a fascinating exercise.
I love it. And encouraging that conversation, talking to people, that's something as a survivor myself is like, having that freedom of speech restricted for so long. You're not allowed to speak about certain things. You're not allowed to discuss things like that. So actually it's the most empowering thing to be able to open up conversations with people about anything. And if you disagree upon something, that's fine. The fact is you're having this conversation, and if you were still in the cult, you wouldn't have been able to have that conversation. So that's such a lovely way of doing it, is just start talking to people, ask their thoughts, and people will realize the cogs start turning in their own mind.
Yeah. So, and they do. It's just they need a language and some basic concepts. Doesn't have to be complicated.
Yeah. Precisely. Look, we're coming up on an hour, so I want to get through some of these comments and questions I've been starring, if that's okay with you, Alex. Firstly, Linda P. Golan, thank you for gifting 5 memberships. That's very kind of you. Welcome aboard, everybody who's now a channel member. John Breen here says, happy to see this is being discussed. Thank you for joining, John. We have D. Thompson, morning chat, 5 a.m. here in Australia, and another hot sunny day to come. Hope you are all well. Well, I'm very jealous. It's not very hot here in the UK, is it, Alex?
No, it's freezing today.
It has been, yeah. And we've got Camilla here saying good evening from Scotland. These are all from the beginning of the stream. Just wanted to give these people some shout outs. SP Crusader, hello everyone. Please remember to like and subscribe. Absolutely. Bok Buddy here says, born in Minneapolis myself. There we go.
Yeah,
representing the USA.
Yeah.
Danielle Chamberlain here, comment, that's interesting that it used to be called FAIR, as I worked in the GO, which is the Guardian's office, now known as the Office of Special Affairs and Scientology, the attack wing. They were one of the organizations on the fair game list. When the Moonies got attacked, the Guardian's office invoked the fair game policy against any aggressors, against most other cults too. Yeah, exactly. Did you experience much fair game from Scientology specifically as a result of your work?
I saw them harass people years back in America. I think it was at a ICSA, International Celtic Studies conference, where there was a speaker. Well, they picketed the conference for a start constantly. And then there was one chap whose name I don't remember who was speaking, who was ex-Scientologist. Oh, they were harassing him. They were outside his hotel room. And I was in the next room over. I had to, did they come after me? Or I can't remember if I did it before they came after me, but I basically had to, I think it was about the forced abortions. I put that in my book. I can't quite remember what happened. And I think the lawyer, they tried to get me to take it out, but then there was so much proof that they didn't hold up, if I'm remembering correctly. But I have, I'm careful about talking about Scientology because I'm extremely aware of how they operate and their legal and financial power. So, I take my hat off to you, apostate Alex, because it takes a few brave souls, and I know you've experienced harassment.
Well,
so,
you're in their crosshairs now that you've been on my channel, Alex.
Sure I
And
am.
I'm sorry for that.
They will already know about me. They certainly know about FST. Maybe I can give a plug to people if they have an extra £5.
Yes.
To share it between Alex and the Family Survival Trust, who are on the Just Giving site.
Absolutely.
Or you can donate through our website, thefamilysurvivaltrust.org, because we're very poor and we like to have a little help.
Absolutely. Well, this is the website for the Family Survival Trust, and I would absolutely recommend. I've put the link in the description, people to go and have a look, and you can donate here with the link on the top right hand corner. And this money all goes towards the activism work that the Family Survival Trust does, and also to providing resources for people who need help leaving and escaping and setting up new lives and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, mostly it goes to the support work, to be honest. Yeah.
Sure.
Just keeping the lights on. Not that we have an office, but if we had one, but there's the expenses of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
As I said, mostly volunteer. So yeah. Anyway,
yeah. And the money does go to good causes. You think about the Aftermath Foundation, which is specifically helping people escape and leave Scientology. The Family Survival Trust is not specific to one cult or one group. It helps anybody who's been in a coercive control situation in many different ways. So absolutely recommend donating and supporting the Family Survival Trust. SP Crusade Leaning here says, please contact your local MP to ask for their support in adding groups to current UK coercive control law. Yeah, that's the key thing, is we just want them to add the group aspect so that it's not specific just to families.
Well, actually, we're not adding the group, we're taking away this only applies in personal, intimate relationships, family or intimate relationships, just to clarify. Because they're not all groups. Like a therapist isn't necessarily a group.
Yeah,
if it's a bad therapist, and there are plenty of them.
Very good. And that's the thing, is that absolutely they're 100% are. But I think that's the thing, is we want, because it currently singles out specifics, that's what we want to remove, so that it's not. We don't want to get into a situation where it starts listing groups or people that can be coercive and things that are, because it just excludes others that haven't been thought about. So it needs to be taken out, so it's more open-ended, so it'll be down to the courts to decide whether that specific individual situation was coercive, rather than the court saying this isn't illegal because it's not a close personal family related or domestic relationship.
Exactly. And so, I mean, I really believe that each person who can manage to contact their MP, whether it's by email or whether it's in person, is going to make a big difference. It's really an important step. And if people can try and do that, it would be fantastic.
100%. Danielle Chamberlain here. Comment: Erin Pizzi was at college with my mother and was a pivotal figure in setting up women's refuges in the UK in the 1960s and 70s. Our Scientology foundations are still in their infancy, but so vital. Yeah, absolutely.
That's the way I look at it, is we're kind of 40 years, we've got 40 years to go. Hopefully we'll go quicker. But, we're where those women's refuges were all those years ago. We're just at the beginning of this fight. But I think because they set a precedent, it's going to be easier for us.
Precisely.
Thanks for that comment.
Yeah. Thank you, Danielle. And Traveling Pandler says, hi, Alex and Dr. Stein. Katura here says, so many people are being manipulated to give money and time. Yeah, 100%. And SP Crusader here, final one. This is a good one to end on, I think. SP Crusader Lini says, comment: absolutely the behavior. I don't care if you believe the earth is flat, etc. Yeah, we may disagree with you.
I'm in.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, you can believe in what you want. I may disagree with your beliefs, but that's okay. The point is, you know, you shouldn't abuse people that disagree with your beliefs.
However, can I just make a philosophical point here?
Go for it. Are you going to open up a big can of worms here, are you now, though?
It's more, it's because of where we are in history and in our contemporary post-industrial societies. The unfortunate thing is people have lost a connection to reality. I mean, this is part of the problem, is that even though we're saying, you know, we don't care what you believe, there is also a problem that many people are not living in what I like to call the reality zone. And that becomes, you know, with all these conspiracy theories and all this stuff, and that's a problem in modern society that we have, that people are less grounded, and because they're isolated, they have less reality validation from other people who are grounded. So instead, they get into these kind of crazy rabbit holes, which often lead into cults. So that, yeah, there's another piece of it, just stepping outwards a bit, which is that it's really important we try and stay grounded in what actually happens to the actual planet, to our actual bodies, to our actual children, you know, to the actual trees, you know, that there is a reality there that we can touch and feel. And I would encourage those of us who are in the reality zone to also talk about that, which doesn't mean negating people's spiritual beliefs, but let's ground them in this reality before the whole damn thing blows up, which it seems on the verge of doing.
Yeah, and
anyway,
and I think there's a great power in education. Like, education is such a good way of doing that. Is, you know, if you find yourself watching stuff on YouTube that you know, or reading stuff on social media that riles you up and gets you really angry, or the opposite, you're only reading stuff that you agree with. You know, maybe you've managed to find yourself in a bit of an echo chamber, and it'd be good to take a step out and just go, hold on a second. You know, these are just people online making videos on YouTube, or these are just people posting stuff on social media. Do they know what they're talking about? And why do I care so much? You know, how is this actually impacting my day-to-day life? So absolutely take breathers and educate yourself on, you know, what it is you're reading, and make sure you're consuming content from different sources that are often opinions that disagree with your own, so that you get a bigger picture, right, rather than just reading stuff that you agree with all the time. So there we go. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Sorry, I went off track, but I wanted to say that.
It's all good. Alex, thank you so much for this. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion, and thank you for your time. I'm really looking forward to, you know, working with you more in the future and collaborating on this. And, you know, we'll have to have you back on, and we'll give more updates on how we're progressing with changing this legislation. But if you're watching this, please make sure you write to your MP. And if you need any support in having those conversations, both Alex and I are here to do that, the Family Survival Trust and all of that. And yeah, make sure you give the video a thumbs up and a subscribe and all that usual jazz. And we'll see you on the very next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex.